background-wise, I know you guys, some of you may know me, some of you don't. Um, I've been in the sports science world for about 35 years and maybe a little bit longer. A lot of it at the beginning with the Olympic rowing team. Um, and then since then, I've kind of moved into healthcare and doing sports science work. When it comes to the endurance side of stuff, I know it was discussed with me to try to keep this simple. You'll notice by the slides that it's probably not going to be the simplest thing in the world. But I'll try and simplify it with the words, but just so that you guys have the data on the slides as we're going through the key points, because you're going to find that I'm not a big proponent of training zones. We're still going to talk about training zones, but I want to go through the physiology of what it is we're actually looking at and what we try to improve when it comes to performance. You guys have picked most of them are triathletes or all of them are triathletes?
There were some swimmers on the invite, but I don't know if
Okay.
they're here.
Okay.
I don't know who's here, so.
So basically, when it comes to triathletes, you're picking three different sports, which is one of the hardest things to do because you have to fit it into a 7-day week. And they all require different physiology and different proponents and different assessments. So what I'll do is I'm just going to kind of move on. Oh,
I just want to see if I can. I want to try.
it's already
Okay, it's
recorded.
perfect. Okay,
Okay,
good.
so now we're
good.
back to, okay. So basically what ISHP is, we're kind of like a lab you would see in a university setting. So we're using all like the metabolic cart, we're using oxygen sensors, we're using foot sensors. We do longevity as well. So we'll do like QEEG data, virtual reality, eye tracking, spirometry. So we're taking the university lab and putting it into a commercial setting. We take that technology and we try and individualize what your training needs to be. And so that's what we're going to go through is show you what the different tests are that we do. And then if people have questions, we can kind of dive into the information as we move along. What I've decided over the decades, kind of what I've gone back down to is to get away from training zones. And what we take a look at is we have 4 different assessments we do. VO₂ Max assessment, which is a fairly quick 10 to 15 minute assessment just to try and figure out what your VO₂ max is. From there, another test we would do at a later date would be the same as the VO₂ max test. So the VO₂ max test would be 1-minute stages to exhaustion. Then what we do is an extended endurance ramp test. If anybody's ever done blood lactate, this is kind of what they do because you're waiting for blood lactate to normalize. Same thing with us. We're waiting for the oxygen and carbon dioxide to normalize when we do the metabolic cart. We're looking for carbon dioxide and fats, everything to normalize, heart rate to normalize. It's the same test as the VO₂ max. It's just 4 minutes at each stage. Okay, that way we can collect more data. The VO₂ may not be the most accurate because fatigue kicks in as you're getting closer to the end. So it may not be a true VO₂ max. The next test we do is a fueling assessment, which isn't to exhaustion. So a fueling assessment is meant for you to tell me, here's the paces I race at. I want to know what's going on with my carbohydrates and fats. So what we do is pick 4 to 5 different paces and we stay there for 6 minutes or a little longer. From there, we just generally we can look at oxygen consumption, but what we're really looking at is carbs and fats. And I'll show you some graphs later on. The last one, which I find people still aren't as good at, is strength and power. So the last assessment we do is we use force plates. We use a Proteus motion machine, which is basically a machine that allows us to go in multi directions and it's concentric only. I'm looking for elasticity. I'm looking for strength. I'm looking for imbalances. I'm not going to talk a lot today about strength and power because in itself, that could be a whole day's talk on how do you develop strength and power effectively for the sport that you're in if you're trying to do strength and plyometric ability. What I am going to say is a quick aside, most people are causing way too much fatigue when they're doing strength and power testing. You shouldn't have any fatigue when you're doing strength and power testing. Yep. You're okay? Okay. That was just a random. Okay. So why does lab testing matter? Because you can basically use your watches and your Garmin's, whatever you want to use. it's important because every athlete is different, and I'll get into other objections later on, and each discipline or each sport is different. So running is different than biking, which is different than swimming. The traditional ways of tracking performance like zones and paces are a good start, but they only tell part of the story. I will circle back around to that because people that are more experienced can use ratings of perceived exertion on race day. But you need to train to understand what that is, okay? Before you headed into race day, because race day might be a more undulating course. It might be more humid. You can't take the data that I gave you and use it for your race day. It's to lead you up to race day. What we measure is oxygen consumption. We measure energy utilization, which is just your carbs, your total calories, your fats. We look at strength, we look at mechanics. I just finished doing a VO₂ Max test where we had little foot inserts on the person, and usually I have oxygen sensors on the legs. What we're trying to do is figure out what the fundamental drivers of performance are and where the weak links are. So with the testing, you get better insights, improve training efficiency, and optimize performance. I'm a sports scientist. I own a company that does sports testing, so I'm going to be biased. But at the end of the day, I like efficiency and I like injury reduction. So yes, you can do a lot of this stuff on your own just with ratings of perceived exertion, but for the most part, there's a lot of things that you probably need to know, regardless of your fitness level, even if it's just from a longevity standpoint. So this is kind of beyond training zones. This is what we look at. Heart rate and pace zones, they're useful starting points. They have limitations. The limitations are that they're not actually measuring oxygen consumption. So if we break down what we do here in the lab, what we look is your VO₂ max, then we look at your running economy. So what's the oxygen consumption at the different intensities that you're going at? So how efficiently do you use oxygen? The end of the road is your muscle. So the NIRS, which is basically like the pulse oximeters people wear on their finger, but it's measuring at a different level, is the oxygen needs to get to the mitochondria, which is in the muscle. These sensors measure the amount of oxygen that's being uptake at the muscle level. From there, we look at fat utilization, and then we also look at your fatigue tolerance, because really at the end of the day, if you're somebody that's running a marathon and you're running at 70% of your VO₂ max, and that's tough for you, we've got a problem we need to deal with, because you should be able to run at a higher percentage of your VO₂ max. And that's kind of, we got to figure out, is it an efficiency problem? Is it a fatigue tolerance problem? And that's what we tease out when we do all the testing. This I just thought I would throw up there because I don't know if you guys follow Instagram or you follow anything else. Zone 2 is the biggest buzzword out there right now, and it's driving me nuts. Okay? Because basically everybody thinks zone 2 is where you have your best training effects for developing mitochondria. Zone 2 is not the only area of training that develops your mitochondria. Okay, and your mitochondria, basically, for those of you that aren't into exercise physiology, is like the gas that's required for your gas tank. That's where it's made. And so what everybody tries to do is they try to get more mitochondria, or they try and get the mitochondria to become more efficient. So we look at growth and we look at function. If you look at this chart, on the left axis is growth. So that means growth is going to be that you get more mitochondria with that type of training. On the bottom axis is function. So as you go farther to the right, that's going to give you better function, better enzymes. You want to get a combination of the both, but if you look at this, none of them sit right on the axes. They all give you some growth. They all give you some function. So I don't want you to think you're wasting your time when you're going out there training and you come in here and I tell you you missed your zone 2, that you're going to start crying on me because you haven't been developing your mitochondria. It's just semantics. You're always developing your mitochondria. So you guys will have that now. This guy's a pretty good guy to follow on Instagram. He works with Moxie, which is the NIRS devices that you put on your legs. Okay, so there's other companies. Okay, so I'm going to dive through the different pillars and just go into it a bit more. So pillar number 1 is I need to know your VO₂ max. So the person we had in today, that's what I was looking at today, is we need to figure out what the ceiling is. How big is your engine? That doesn't mean I know how well you use your engine. I just need to know what it is. Okay, that's your limitation. VO₂ max has a huge genetic component to it, so there's a law of diminishing returns after a little while. So if somebody has a higher VO₂ max than you, it may just predominantly be genetics. It doesn't mean you're not going to beat that person. And then many times in here, I have friends talking to one another in here and they're talking, well, your VO2 is higher than mine, but I beat you all the time. And so that just means that that person is using a higher percentage of their VO2 when they're running. Right? So what is VO2 max? I think everybody talks about it, but I don't think anybody actually really knows what it is when they're talking about it. VO2 max is the most oxygen your body can use during exercise. It's not the fastest you can go. It's just the most amount of oxygen you can use, and it taps out. Okay, and you can't use any more regardless of how fast you go. The higher VO2 max just means that you have a bigger endurance potential. So when I worked with the Olympic rowing team, one of the things we did was we could actually 100% predict who was going to win based on their anaerobic threshold, not on their VO2 max. The VO2 max was all over the place with these guys. Within, like, they're all pretty good, but we could 100% predict the person that had the highest fractional VO2, meaning the highest VO2 at that pace, was going to win. Okay. Now, how do we measure that? Well, there's pictures in here, but we have a mask on your face and it's measuring oxygen and carbon dioxide consumption. And from there, there's a bunch of formulas that occur. So really, VO2 max is the size of your engine. Oxygen is the main fuel source for endurance athletes, except for when you hit hills or when you're trying to finish the race. Then you start to get into using stored ATP, carbohydrates, which can get you faster fuel. Okay. The idea behind endurance training you're going to find for me is, though, I want you to save that as long as you can for when you need it. It means you need to get better at burning fat as a fuel source at higher intensities. And right now there's two camps. There's one camp where everybody's starting to do like 300 grams of carbs per hour. Okay. And I'm fine with that. But if you can actually train your body to use better fat, you only need about 30 grams an hour. And so I'm not saying which one's better, but there's a lot of people that can't handle even 100 grams of carbohydrates. So it's just really what you're comfortable with and what you want to do. I'm not saying it doesn't help your performance, but long-term wise, from a health perspective, because I'm a healthcare practitioner, constantly doing the gel packs day after day after day in large quantities can actually, 30% of endurance athletes tend to develop what's called metabolic syndrome, which is pre-diabetes, fat storage. So do you want to play Russian roulette with that? That's up to you. Okay. So every step requires oxygen in an endurance. So as we're going through, I'll show you that. If the supplier uses limited, performance is, I shouldn't put suffers, performance is going to end soon. So as soon as you get into using carbs and stored ATP, you have a finite amount of that. Fat, you have an infinite amount of that in the body. Even if your body fat's 8%, you have enough to last days. Right. Okay, so here's the path of oxygen. I know this is simple for some of you, but I think you need to come back to this. When I come and do testing, this is what I'm looking for. We do spirometry to test the lungs out. We use a pulse oximeter to determine how much of the oxygen is actually diffusing into the systemic circulation. Then the oxygen, that's the oxygen moves into the blood. Then the heart pumps it through the body. So it comes from the lungs to the heart. It pumps it to the rest of the body. That's the mask. Right? I'm measuring how your cardiorespiratory system at that point. Then the blood is delivered to the muscles. I use the sensors on the legs or any muscle part that you want to be tested. At the muscles, we see what the supply and the demand is. So you're looking at if your curve is going up, it means your heart's able to deliver more oxygen than your body needs. If the oxygen is steady, that's your steady state, and you could probably run at that indefinitely. If it's going down, depending on the slope, will determine how long you're going to last. Okay, that means your demand is greater than your supply. And then at the muscle tissue, this is where people probably don't want to hear this stuff because it's a little bit maybe too sciencey, but you need to know what the end product is. And the end product is the mitochondria using the oxygen to help create the ATP. And I am going to go into that physiology a little bit. Okay, so as the oxygen enters the mitochondria, the power plants, it acts as the final electron receptor. It just means it's the end of the chain. This step keeps the energy flowing. So if you don't have the mitochondria there to pick up the electrons that are being produced from all the chemical reactions that are occurring while you're running, you're going to fatigue. You're going to need to rely on your anaerobic system, which means you're going to have to slow down. So ATP, which is your fuel, your gas in your tank, is being constantly produced, but at different rates. The waste products you produce, which we're measuring in the mass, is going to be your carbon dioxide. So we measure your oxygen utilization and how much carbon dioxide you're blowing off. So if we think of it, oxygen is like the plug at the end of the drain. Without it, the system clogs. Okay. With it, energy flows smoothly. So you need oxygen to allow for continued energy supply. So VO2 max, just to drive the point home, it's the size of your engine. The bigger the engine, the more potential power, but efficiency still decides how far and how fast you go. And so VO2 consumption would be how good is your gas mileage? VO2 max is how big is your engine. And then I thought of this the other day. If you have a pipe and you're putting water through a pipe and you're putting it through slowly, that would be like how much oxygen you're consuming. When you increase the tap, at some point, it doesn't matter how much you increase the tap, the pipe is only so big, you're not going to get any more oxygen or water through the pipe. Okay, so the bigger the pipe, the better the VO2 max is going to be. Here's where we differentiate between competitors. The competitor on the left, where you don't see holes in the pipe, can probably run at a higher VO2 than the person who's leaking. We just got to figure out why they're leaking. Okay. Here's another way to look at it on a chart. A small engine, you're not going to have as much power as a large engine. Small pipes, you're not going to have as much VO2 max as you would with a wide pipe. Okay. And the other thing is people are like, well, I don't really need to know my VO2 max. You do pretty much in every facet of life. It's actually tightly correlated to your longevity and your overall health. So it's one of the strongest indicators. The other one is your power. Okay, your power output is another good indicator of your longevity and your risk of disease. So it should be monitored yearly as a part of a wellness check, even if you guys aren't considering to do this because of your activity. You should be monitoring it year over year so that we can jump on things if we start to see declines that aren't explainable. Yeah. Pillar 2 is the same as the VO2 max test. It's just instead of calling it a VO2 max at the end, we call it a VO2 peak. Okay, because it's a longer test and fatigue creeps into the equation. What is it? It's 4-minute stages on a treadmill or a bike. Okay, you can do it in the water. And I actually just had a client in the other day that showed me a piece of tech, which you guys are probably already aware of. The goggles tell him his paces. Okay, and it's around $500. So because of him showing me that, we technically could do fitness testing in the water now that I can monitor your pace. Okay, so we would get heart rate, we would get pace, and the little sensors that I put on your legs are waterproof. So now I can get oxygen consumption on the legs. So yes, it's more money for you guys to spend on somebody like myself, but it was something I hadn't really looked at. Most of it was just what's your biomechanics like in the water, but you can actually treat swimming like you can biking and running. Okay, this measures, aerobic and anaerobic isn't my favorite terminology because everything is basically aerobic. Okay, and everything is basically anaerobic. They just contribute in different amounts. What we tend to do for the 4-minute step, because you're getting to homeostasis and more consistency, I like to throw the inserts in the shoes. I like to do a video analysis. I like to put the oxygen sensors on, and then we always do spirometry to measure to see if the start of the line is a problem. Okay, and then we build a full map of the training zones and the thresholds because everybody still fights with me that they want to know their training zones. And so we still give that to you. Here's an example of what we might pull off either the VO2 max test or the extended ramp test. The two lines here that are like bluish, the darker blue line is the fat use. The lighter blue line is your carbohydrate use. And going from left to right, it just means the person's going harder and harder on the treadmill or the bike. And you can see what happens to the carbohydrates. The carbohydrates start to climb, and then the fat starts to drop. You can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 crossovers. So which one is it? Right? That's my argument. And then you'll even see, and I can't really do it on here, but in some people, you'll see the fat, which is what happened in your case today. You'll see the fat continue to stay elevated after the crossover. So is that your zone 2? At that point, I don't care what it's called. I care that that's a good speed for you to train at to get better at using fat, and the crossover is just used for research purposes. Okay. The red line is just heart rate. Heart rate, I don't generally look at heart rate other than at the beginning of like a hard activity or during your recovery. So we do something called the Wingate test. And the Wingate test, what I'll look at is we look at your heart rate kinetics. So what's the quality of the climb of your heart rate during the recovery, what's the quality of the drop of the heart rate? And we determine if you have issues there, but that's a whole other test. Here's other examples that we pull off the 4-minute test. So the graph on the left, if you look at the chart, you'll see it goes up to VO2 max. 100 is that person's VO2 max, okay? And then the blue represents the percentage of the VO2 they were using at the different paces. And then I put on here, because on the treadmill we have its miles per hour, but I converted it to pace in minutes per kilometer at the bottom. And so you'll see the different paces are running at and what the percentage. So what they would tell me is, if they said to me, Scott, I know this is going to be slow, just bear with me. If I run a 7:27 minute per kilometer pace, if you look on this chart, that means they're running at 70% of their VO2 max. And if they're a marathon athlete, they're leaving a lot on the table. I've just got to figure out why now. Okay, so that's how we use that chart. If you are within the range that I need you in, then I've got to figure out how can I make you more efficient so you use less oxygen at that speed. Now, once I drop that, you can move to a higher speed. Okay, so that's kind of what we look at. The graph on the right is fat utilization. And when we go do the fueling, I'll show you more of these just to show you the variety in people. But this is the same kind of thing, a 4-minute test. Starts at 3.5 miles an hour and goes up to 7 miles an hour. And the orange color is the amount of fat that they're using. So this person at 3.5 is predominantly using fat. Okay, and then as we go along, there's a steep drop off, and then it kind of levels, and then there's another drop off. How do we use that data? On the chart, I will actually tell you how many grams of fat you burn per minute at each intensity so that you can determine your fueling. However, this is in our temperature controlled room. Yes, when you get outside, this is where I don't know the answer. I can only give you research. 30 to 40% increase in carbohydrate use in human environments. Okay, so you would have to add 30% on whatever it is you think you need, minimum. Okay. So here's how we work with the VO2. First, we want to see what your VO2 is, and then we want to increase your sustainable VO2. That means I want to see how close you can get to your VO2 max and sustain that for the distance of your race. Then we want to improve the efficiency so I can lower that. By lowering that, you can now go faster and push the ceiling. But we have to make sure your VO2 is where it's supposed to be because it could be a limiting factor. Okay. So if somebody has a VO2 max of 50 and another person has a VO2 max of 70, the person at 50 is never going to run at 60. Okay. And then this is just kind of, you guys don't need to read all that. I just want to show you, this is how we dive into what the two problems are. Here's what the training recommendations are. So if you have a problem with economy, you want to do strength training, running drills, pacing practice, fatigue resistance, change your technology like your shoes, etc. If you have a problem with your running your VO2 at race pace, you do interval training, hill repeats, longer tempos, etc. So those are the two areas that we would start to dive into, and then coaches would have other. So this is where the art and the science kind of meet together. And the only thing I'm going to say is when you're picking something to work on, whether it's this, the other reason you want to do testing is to see whatever intervention that you've used, did it do what you wanted it to do? And that's where people come back in and test to see, did they make the physiological change that they were trying to make? Pillar number 3, fueling assessment. So this is where you come in, and this is not a test to exhaustion. It's not slow, it's not fast. You just tell me, Scott, I need to know some information. I need to know a bunch of different paces and what my carbohydrate utilization is. So we go 6-minute stages so that I can ignore the first 2 or 3 minutes. I just completely write it off. And then we get into homeostasis. So it measures how much energy comes from carbs and fats. It's still the same mask, same equipment. We're just not going to go to exhaustion. So here's an example, and I just want you guys to see the different numbers. So this person going at a 7:27 pace was burning 0.8 grams per minute, all the way up to 7 miles per hour. A 5:20 pace, he was burning 0.82 grams per minute. So the last 2 stages, he was actually more efficient there with his fat usage. From there, I multiply that by 60 to get me an hour. And then the length of your race, I multiply by 3 or 4, depending on how, or 11 hours, depending on what it is you're doing. That'll determine your carbohydrate requirements. What I didn't put on here is, though, that your body already stores carbohydrates. And I have a chart that kind of gives us an idea based on your sex and your weight, roughly how many carbs you would store. So if your race took 4,000 calories of carbs, and you have a 2,000 calorie storage, you need to supplement to replace the 2,000 carbs during your race. If it's a 10K race and the race only uses 1,000 calories, do you need to supplement with carbohydrates? No. Okay, so that's how we use that. Here's another example. This person's at 7.5, so it's more fit. But at 7.5, this person at 7 was using 0.82. This person's using 0.48 at 7.5. Okay, so they're relying more on carbohydrates, and they probably aren't doing the same nutritional intervention as this person is doing. Okay, they're probably somebody that gels a lot more. And so they're teaching their body how to use more carbohydrates. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just telling you this is probably what's happening. Then the next one is same. This is a 4-minute test, but I got good data off there as well. Just to show you all the different fats at different speeds. And then here's a bike test. So this is wattage. I don't possibly know whose this is. And so here you can tell we can't use the running data for the bike data, okay? And so on here, 120 watts, this person was burning 0.38 grams per minute. I don't know if they would consider that an easy speed or not, but I assume they would. And then they're using a lot of carbohydrates already on the bike. The reason you can't use the bike to the running is because the running uses different muscle groups, plus it has elasticity involved. Okay, so there's eccentric movements involved. The bike is mostly concentric, and you're using more quad. It's more quad dominant. So you're using.
It should be more glute dominant.
It should be, but you'll tend to see this is on the quads, right? So you're seeing that the quads are using a lot of carbohydrates, right? And then you can play around with the anatomy of the person and what they should be using for muscle activity. We can put the sensors on glutes, but most people don't like me doing that. Okay. I have done it. The next pillar is strength and power.
Would that be on a 12 or work bike?
What's that?
Was that?
It was on, yeah. Yeah, I don't know who the person was, but yes.
That's the question. So
yes.
The results though, that's just measuring, that's just me measuring the breathing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay, so you wouldn't be able to tell if I was using quads or glutes based on this.
No,
That would be interesting to say, because I'm not trying to.
So how would I, with more sensors,
Yeah.
you would put you would both glutes and hamstrings, and we've done that, right? Because some people were like, but from an oxygen standpoint, it doesn't really matter, right? We seem to see the same quality of graph, no matter what muscle group. It could be on your shoulder. Even if you're a cyclist, we tend to see the same quality. But from a fat and carbohydrate use, now we're actually talking about muscle fiber using different like carbs and fats as a fuel source. And it's different between the bike and different muscles on the bike compared to the running. You're okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Strength and power. I know a lot of people are starting to get into this. I am going to put a course together on this so that people understand that if they get a trainer, that at least they have the knowledge to know that if what the trainer's doing with them, is it the most efficient way to train? Because I'm coming back to efficiency. Any type of training is going to help. Some type of training is going to lead you faster to injury and overworking. Okay, and in strength and power, I'm telling you right now, you do not want fatigue. Okay, and when I worked with the rowing team, some of you are more elite athletes. These guys are training and the girls are training 30 to 40 hours a week. If I put a strength and conditioning program together and they were sore, do you know what the coaches would do to me? Yeah. Okay. And so you're saying, oh, well, then they just work out easier. No, they don't work out easier. You just need to understand how not to cause muscle damage and still get maximum benefit. Right. And I used to argue with my professors in university all the time. I'm like, you guys have never stepped outside of the classroom. Right. I get what you're saying in here. Sometimes training to failure is better than not training to failure. But in the grand scheme of things, the research is even coming around to show that that's not true. Right. And so really what it is, stronger muscles is faster, more resilient performance. How do we test it? We use force plates, accelerometers, the Proteus motion. We do use the oxygen sensors on the legs sometimes as well. Okay, and we're looking for weak links and imbalances that might limit performance. The whole argument of it does imbalances lead to injury risk, I think it's more individual than it is you can just say yes or no. Okay. Why does strength and power matter? It's the idea is to protect the tendons and the joints, but at the end of the day, if your genetics can't handle what you're doing, you're going to deteriorate. And so I had one of my technicians reach out to me and say that they have an athlete that's come into them and they've had 2 stress fractures in their hips. They went and did strength and conditioning, et cetera. Now they've come back, they have a stress fracture in their foot. And they want to know if I can help. And I'm like, I don't think you're going to like my conversation. Because my conversation is whatever you're doing is past the tolerance level of your body. And this person wants to do a lot of mileage, and I'm going to be the one that says, your body can't handle it. So the other part of this is if you do your training properly and you're good at using body fat, you're going to have carbohydrates left at the end to allow for a larger kick. And if you have the muscles to go with it, you're going to blow past people. Okay. And then durability obviously is when fatigue sets in. I made this up today. I know it might be a little bit confusing, but what I wanted to do was show you guys what the different training stimuli does. So when we do hill sprints, because I'm talking about hill sprints also develop your mitochondria just like zone 2 does, but hill sprints develop the function. The zone 2 develops the growth. Okay. And what I wanted to do, because everybody's like, well, can't I just do hill sprints? And I'm like, yeah, you can, but you need to know when to put it in and when to do it because it creates a lot of wear and tear. So if you're just trying to create central adaptations at the heart and the lungs, you can just hop on a stationary bike and do wind sprints and you're going to get mitochondrial growth and function. At some point biomechanically though, remember you're not using the same muscles. That means you're not going to have the adaptation at the muscle tissue. Okay, so you do have to do different things. So what I tried to put on here is neural drive and power. That's basically your power output. That's in the top left. Mitochondrial adaptation is in the far right, and at the bottom is your running specificity and elasticity. Where do each one of these fit? So if we look at hill sprints are really good for all of it. So it gets you good neural drive, gets you good mitochondrial adaptation, it gets you good running specificity and elasticity. What I didn't put on there is the injury risk and the fatigue that it would cause. Okay, you need to be smart with that. So then I asked if we were to do partial squats and lunges, what would happen there, right? Because that's a little bit less wear and tear. Can you just do that? And then, so now you look at the green graph, it's not quite as good. You don't get quite as much neural drive. You definitely don't get as much specificity. And then the mitochondrial adaptations aren't as great. And that's the green shaded graph. And then if we look at plyometrics, that's the orange one. You see how it's kind of shifted to the left and doesn't really do anything with mitochondrial adaptation. And it shouldn't, because you shouldn't be having any fatigue when you're doing plyometric training. And then when we look at the stationary bike, that's going to be the red. It kind of sits into mitochondrial adaptations. It's just not going to do much for neural drive if you're a runner. Okay. And it's not going to do much for running specificity. So that's kind of, you guys can have that and just take your time to look through it. You have to take. Okay. All right. So now we're getting close to the end here. I just plopped in a few things that I get asked all the time. The technology that I wear on my chest and my wrist, is it accurate? I don't care. I really don't care if it's accurate. What it's good at is detecting change. Okay. If you need accuracy, you need to put the mask on. Okay. Because the mask is directly measuring your oxygen consumption. And these things yet cannot do that. They use heart rate. They use heart rate variability. They look at your paces. They're pretty good at detecting if you're improving. So if your goal is to improve your VO2 max, you can use the watch to see if you've improved your VO2 max. You're just not going to know the number. Okay. What they don't measure is gases in the lungs. They don't measure oxygen use at the muscles, and they're not going to give you uric fats and carbs. They're good at detecting change over time, showing improvement or decline. They're a rough estimate of your training zones. However, I haven't met a person yet that it's given the proper zone 2 for. Okay. Then that just comes back to why lab testing matters. And in this day and age, because the equipment is getting cheaper and cheaper, these tests are more affordable to do on everybody. You don't have to try and get to be a part of a study. So now I'm just going to go through what you guys should be thinking of instead of training zones. You want to build up your aerobic base. How do you do that? You want to pick the speeds at which you burn fat the most. So I don't care what you want to call it. So in one zone two, you just need to know what intensity that is. What does it do? It helps the heart, the lungs, the mitochondria. Okay, it helps develop capillaries around the muscle fibers. It makes the muscle fibers a little smaller so oxygen doesn't have to travel as far. Okay, next is fat utilization. So that's that test we did, whether it's the 4-minute one or the 6-minute one. What we want to look at is your ability to burn fat at submaximal paces so that you can save your carbohydrates for later. And then how do you improve that? Well, you improve it with long runs. But if you were to ask me what is the most effective way to improve your fuel utilization, it's through manipulating your nutrition with your exercise. And most people make a mistake here. They look at stuff and they try and carb deplete all day long for days on end. That's going to impair your performance. Nutritional fueling to improve fat utilization, which is called periodized nutrition, is that you only do it during the long runs. You're carb depleted on the long runs. Why? Because that's the mitochondrial is starting to, you're training it to use fat. And for some reason, which we're not really sure of yet, it tends to carry over to the higher intensities, right? By almost threefold. So if you were burning 0.2 grams, it moves up to like 0.6 to 0.8 grams without even training at that speed. Okay, at the faster paces. So nutritional interventions combined with the lower intensity, I'm going to say the lower level runs, will help you get better at burning fat. Fractional, it's a big word. Fractional utilization just means how can I get you to run at a higher percentage of your VO2 max at so that means you're going to be at a faster speed, sustained. Okay, so that's what we look for when we do the testing. And then I have that chart that shows what's your weakness. Those are the two areas you would focus on. Is it efficiency or is it that you can't handle the fatigue at that pace? Okay, or a combination of both, which leads us to economy and efficiency. The miles per gallon of your gas car, we're trying to make you more economical so you can run faster with the same effort. And then we look at gait analysis, drills, and strength and power to fall into that category, to make you more efficient. You use less energy per stride. Fatigue tolerance. So fatigue tolerance is basically your hill sprints, the wind sprints on the bike. What that does is if you do like all out efforts for 20 or 30 seconds and you have short rest periods, you actually increase your bicarbonate system in your body so that you teach yourself how to handle higher levels of fatigue and make your brain ignore it. Okay. I'm just going to go on stuff that I hear and hear because anytime we talk about testing at different points, people always say this to me. And it's like, I'm not at that level yet. And I'm like, well, testing isn't just for elite athletes. It's for anyone who wants to stay healthy and improve their performance effectively and efficiency. I don't like to waste time. I'm not fit enough. The test is based on your fitness. It ends when you're at your level, right? Everybody's going to be different. I only race recreationally. Well, testing reduces injury risk because I can start to take a look at, do you have loss of power? What are the things that are reduced on yours where I can keep you healthy? I don't race. VO2 max and fueling are also wellness tools, right? I talked about longevity. Okay, it sounds too scientific. Today I went through this really quickly because I know it's Sunday and people want to get out of here. But really when we do the reports, you get the report, plus I'll do 30 minutes to 60 minutes of a talk with you so that we dial it in. If you have a coach, they can take this information and help and whatever their opinions are on the matter, they can take it from there. I'm always there to help. Is it worth the cost? Well, in the long run, it saves time and money by preventing injuries and wasted training. Key takeaways from this then is going to be you need to know your VO2 max because it's your ceiling. You need to know what percentage of your VO2 max are you running at. You also need to know your VO2 max from a key health and longevity marker. And then we combine all the 4 pillars to try and develop your physiological profile. Here's kind of what it would look like. You would spend most of your time on your aerobic base. You would spend time on fat utilization. fractional utilization, running economy, and fatigue tolerance. And it depends on where you are in the season as to which bars are the largest. Adaptation, so I mentioned this earlier, I just wanted to make sure I had a slide in here because I don't want people trying to take their biking data and apply it to their running data or their swimming data. Your heart and lungs are shared, so any effects you get from the bike, swimming, or running, all the central, the heart and the lungs are all going to improve your performance, okay? You're going to get increases in your heart and lung capability. When you're doing different activities like cycling compared to running, it changes the muscles and the tissues you use. So cycling builds quadriceps and glutes and hams. It depends on the person, how they're doing it. Running strengthens tendons, and it's mostly eccentric. How do you handle the constant impact? So the training and the analysis would be used to interpret the data correctly, and the testing must match the discipline. What I wanted to add in there is, and I didn't throw it in the presentation, is I talked about this at the beginning, perceived exertion needs to be a huge component of that. And when you're going through your training season, you should be putting down your levels of perceived exertion at the different intensities. And then try not to use all the data I just gave you as a be all to end all when you're racing, because you don't know how you're feeling that day. You don't know what the course is like. You don't know what the temperature is like. You need to listen to yourself at that point, okay? But you can still use that. If you know your perceived exertion, you should be able to save yourself for the end of these races to do your little kick. And that is it. It's not too fast. Okay, any questions? Any questions online? Are you guys still there?
Still here.
Okay, yes.
Maybe apologize for the ignorance here, but between like fat and carbs as fuel sources, is there one that's preferred versus another in terms of like efficiency or outcome?
It depends on your goal. So somebody like you told me what, 5 and 10K?
Yeah.
I'd want you to be so good at using carbohydrates, it's not funny.
Right.
Right? Where somebody else that's in a triathlon, I need them to spare their carbohydrates,
I see.
right? Anything? Everybody's good? Okay,
Just, you mentioned the heat. effect.
Yes,
So, and you said 30, I think 30%.
that's
So,
the research.
like, if there was like, can you, obviously it's dependent on like the temperature, but is there like, okay, so if you do the testing in here, which is probably like, I don't know, 18, but there's no fan, there's no
No,
evaporative
yeah,
cooling
no.
really. How could you, like, what temperature would that be equivalent to outside?
This in here, because there's no wind. I would just say like 22 degrees,
Okay.
not windy.
And then how could you, if say it was 32 degrees?
Right, what do I do?
What would you
Right.
just ballpark?
So what I would typically do, and let's make the math simple. Let's
Yeah.
say you needed 100 grams every hour. I would go to 140. But you have to train to be able to handle that before you do it. Don't just all of a sudden that day
Right.
do
Yeah,
140.
yeah.
Or else I'm gonna get a lot of emails and phone calls as to how much it cost them to do the race and they had to drop out and. Yeah, so that would be the guideline. So then my comment to that is if you could get more fat adapted, then you might be going from 30 to 50 grams.
It's interesting, I made a spreadsheet based on my data
Yes,
and then what I actually did in the race. And it has predicted when I'm gonna run out of fuel. And if I had actually followed my good power numbers,
yeah,
I could have lasted a lot longer
yes,
before I ran out of fuel. So
Yes.
it's been very useful to
Yeah.
actually see, okay, this is what I took in.
yeah,
This is approximately what I probably was burning in terms of carbohydrates.
yes,
And in each of my races, I can predict where I would
Yeah.
fail. And if I haven't failed in a race, it's because it was cooler.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
adapted or I
Yeah.
didn't try to eat too much.
Yeah.
Or I met my needs.
yeah.
So it's.
And that's,
very
so from a
interesting.
race pace standpoint, it helps you dial in your nutrition.
Yes.
There's obviously other factors that come into why you may not perform well. You may have an injury developing, a cold developing, who the undulations, the humidity is crazy. But for the most part, you can still use the data Because doing the 30 to 40% increase is a guess, but it's an academic guess. You would get better at that over time to dial that in. And you would look at the humidity, the barometry, the temperature, the wind, and you can say, okay, today I need this many carbs. Normally I wouldn't, but today I'm going to bump it up by 30 to 40%. You've already put the work in to handle more carbs if you need it. And then you shouldn't have any excuses nutritionally. Okay, I'll stop
Hey,
sharing.
Scott, it's Tara here.
Hey, Ted.
I just was wondering if you could comment or provide clarity. So I just wanted to emphasize because my nutrition ears went up, and hold on. So two points. One, if somebody is doing carb depleted, that is not carb eliminated.
Correct.
And two, that means they're actually having to do their long stuff at slow,
Yep.
low intensity, not typically. And I'm just calling out a lot of people probably tend to run their long stuff a little too fast.
Correct.
And this should be happening in non-race season when people are trying to encourage fat adaptation, not in performance season when they're trying to maximize performance.
Yeah, and I think you pretty much answered everything there already. I'll just kind of add to it. So I didn't put a flow chart in that shows when do you do the carb depletion. And what I didn't add in, it's not calorie depleted. So let's say normally you have a 600 calorie meal before you go to bed or before you run, and then you run a few hours later. You would still have 600 calories, but it would come from fat and it would come from protein. Okay. The speed you go at, I know I'm making it complicated by saying don't worry about your zones. The speed you're going to go at is the speed that you're most effective at burning fat at. So whatever that is for that person. And then it would be, it needs to be away from competition time because really you're supposed to be moving into higher intensity stuff the closer you get to competition. How fast do you see the adaptations? We've seen a 3-fold increase in 4 weeks. So you can see big changes in the off season quickly and not have to spend a lot more time on that. And what we did also notice, what we also did notice is when you become fat adapted and you start to take your carbohydrate supplements, it's not changing your fat utilization during your runs. For people that aren't fat adapted and they go to ingest. So what happened was the person did their fitness test. They looked at their carbs and their fats. They rested 20 minutes and took 40 grams of carbs. And they ran again and the fat use was not much different because they'd already gone through their fat adaptation training. And they didn't see any real significant changes in their fat use with the carbohydrate ingestion. So did I miss anything else in there, Tara, that you were asking?
No, I had just wanted to emphasize because people tend to think, oh, I'm going to deplete carbs, and then they go do a 2-hour run with no carbs, and that just increases stress, increases risk of fatigue and injury and all that stuff. And so knowing that like 30 grams of carbs per hour for a 2+ hour activity, is still fueling because I know a lot of people fail to even hit that. At times. So I just, those nuances, I appreciate you adding some clarity to that.
I'll pass the flow chart to you so that you can hand it out. But basically the flow chart is like 10 to 30 grams an hour during the carb depleted runs, if you feel you need it.
And just how many carbs would a low carb breakfast be?
It would be like, you want to have about, I would say like maybe 30 to 50 grams type thing, right? And then you need to play around with it. And that's where, let's say you track everything you're doing. We've already done the fueling assessment. You track everything you're doing. You redo the fueling assessment, let's say 8 weeks later. Did it work for you? So I have a technician where he did the fat adaptation. We saw a 3-fold increase in his fat use. And then he changed things a little bit and he actually lost his performance and his fat utilization a little bit. So we knew what worked for him now, right? He said he was still trying to do it, but he wasn't as dialed in. So, but that comes back to the need for me to keep my business alive. Right? No. Okay, anything else? Okay, I'm going to sign off. thank you to everybody for joining in. If you have any questions, you can obviously reach out to myself or anybody from you're their coach, basically.
Well, not for everybody,
Okay.
just I know of them. Some
Okay.
of them are my athletes.
Yeah, so you guys can reach out to me directly. Anything other than that, thank you for showing up.
I can send a follow-up.
Okay. Okay, goodbye, everybody.
Thanks for your time, Scott and Lauren
Thanks, Tara. Bye.
and Miranda for organizing it.